For centuries, he was celebrated as the man who made Castile independent from the Kingdom of León. But what if that's wrong? I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and in episode 45, we separate legend from reality in the story of Fernán González. The foundational myths of Castile. The story of how Castile was born has been the subject of legends and historical distortions that have little to do with reality. Foundational myths are, in the end, common all over the world. In Asturias with Pelagius, in Catalonia with Count Wilfred the Hairy, in China with its legendary emperors, or in Japan with gods. In the case of Castile, the need to glorify its origins arose in the 12th and 13th centuries, when an independent Kingdom of Castile was consolidated apart from León, and later when the Crown of Castile was formed. We can speak of two legends that shape the collective identity of the Castilian nation: the legend of the judges of Castile and the legend of how Count Fernán González achieved the independence of his county from León. Beginning with the judges of Castile, there are two versions of the story. One places it after the death of Alfonso II of Asturias in the 840s, during the civil war between Napoleon and Ramiro. The other places it after the death of King Fruela II of León, when another civil war broke out over the throne. In any case, both versions share the idea that this was a moment of weakness in royal authority, which the Castilians took advantage of in order to be free and have a just government. According to the legend of the judges of Castile, the Castilians were resentful because they were forced to travel long distances to León to resolve political and judicial matters, and because they were treated there with disdain. In addition, they were supposedly dissatisfied because they wanted to expand westward toward the Cea and Pisuerga rivers, but León would not allow them to. Because of these alleged grievances, the Castilians chose two magistrates from among the aristocracy, known as judges, who will govern them according to Castilian customs and traditions, with the aim of protecting their freedoms in contrast to the situation they faced under Leonese rule. According to Castilian minstrels, Judge Lain Calvo, in charge of military affairs, was an ancestor of El Cid, while Judge Nuño Resura, in charge of justice, was an ancestor of Count Fernán González. Of course, this entire story of the judges of Castile is an invention. The first written references to them appears in the 12th century, that is, 2 or 3 centuries after the supposed events. Their existence is incompatible with what Castilian documents tell us, and in the county of Castile not only was customary law used, but the Visigothic Liber Judiciorum was also applied, just as among the rest of the Christian population of medieval Iberia. In the same way, the historical figure of Fernán González has been greatly exaggerated and credited with many achievements that never occurred. A monk from the monastery of San Pedro de Arlanza, the most important monastery in Comital Castile and where Fernán González was buried, wrote in the 13th century the epic poem known as the Poem of Fernán González, based in part on the feats already sung by minstrels of the time. The monk clearly intended to highlight the connection between Fernán González and his monastery, although some researchers also link the composition of the poem to the magnate Nuño González de Lara, who, as a descendant of Fernán González, sought to exalt his lineage. The poem presents Fernán González as the good count, the champion of Castilian independence, and the bravest defender of the Catholic faith against the Muslims. To emphasize his humility and later greatness, the poem recounts that the young Fernán González was kidnapped by a charcoal burner who raised him in the mountains, until one day the man told him that he was actually of noble lineage. Seeing how his homeland was threatened by Muslims, the Castilian hero left the mountains, and the Castilians recognized him as their lord. The Count of Castile then defeated the Andalusia strongman Almanzor, the Muslim name that inspired the greatest terror in the Christian collective memory. However, chronologically, this could not have happened, since Fernán González died a few years before Almanzor's campaigns. This epic account also makes up a war between Castile and the Kingdom of Pamplona and the County of Toulouse, with the aim of presenting Castile as a victim oppressed by the Leonese and attacked by Navarrese and Muslims. Under Fernán González's leadership, the Castilians supposedly defeated and killed the King of Pamplona and the Count of Toulouse, and then once again faced Almanzor in the legendary Battle of Athenas. Before the battle, Saint Emilian, the revered hermit from the Visigothic period who became the patron saint of Castile and Pamplona, appeared to the Count in a dream and gave him military advice, because, of course, a hermit must have had extensive military experience. On the third day of battle, the Castilians were in a critical situation until Spain's apostle, Saint James, appeared on the battlefield with a ghostly army that put the Muslims to flight. The poem of Fernán González continues its epic with an absurd story about how the hero of Castile managed to free his land from Leonese rule. King Sancho the Fat summoned the Count of Castile to the court in León. Fernán González arrived with a horse and a falcon that had belonged to Almanzor, and the King of León took a fancy to them and offered a large sum of money to buy them. Sancho and Fernán set a payment date and agreed that the debt would double each day if the king failed to pay on time. Years passed until the Count of Castile reminded Sancho of his debt. When they calculated the amount, Sancho was astonished and promised to release him from vassalage and grant him sovereignty over Castile if Fernán González forgave the debt. Thus, according to the legend, it was an unpayable debt that allowed Castile's independence, not a rebellion or an epic battle. Maribel Fierro and other scholars before her have studied the Andalusi Islamic origins of this legend, since it is part of an Arabic literary motif that reached the Islamic world through Indian tales in which a debt doubles every day after the due date. Likewise, the motif of horses and falcons is another device widely used in Arabic literature. For example, it was said that the famous Count Julian of Ceuta brought horses and falcons from Tangier to the Visigothic king Roderick, and that after Roderic's legendary rape of Julian's daughter, Julian promised to bring horses and falcons unlike any ever seen before, a metaphorical reference to the Islamic conquerors. In both the legend of Count Julian and that of Fernán González, the horse and the falcon serve as a lesson on how the desire and ambition of rulers can lead to catastrophic and unpredictable consequences. The legend of the judges Laín Calvo and Nuño Rasura also has Islamic inspiration, since their baldness refers to the practice of some Berbers of shaving their heads as a sign of identity, sometimes linked to Jarahite rebellions. The two judges, as rulers, also reflect how, after the disappearance of the Umayyad dynasty of Córdoba, some Islamic judges were chosen by their communities to lead them and founded their own dynasties. Therefore, Castilian epic literature and the foundational myths of Castile have Andalusi Islamic roots that are little recognized but clearly present, one more demonstration of Muslim influence on the culture of the Christian kingdoms of Iberia. The Castilian legends, developed especially in the 13th century after the formation of the Crown of Castile, reveal more about how Castilians saw themselves at that time than about the reality of the 10th century, when Castile was still a county of the Kingdom of León. The reunification of Castile under Fernán González. At the beginning of the 10th century, Castile was a loosely defined amalgam of territories with different centers of power. After the death of Count Rodrigo of Castile and Álava in 873, this county separated, and later, after the death of his son Diego Rodríguez in 885, the county of Castile fragmented into multiple counties. Several decades of intense political competition followed among the different families that held comital authority. There were several counts because, as I have explained many times, in the early Middle Ages one was not king of or count of a territory in the anachronistic way we often say today. Rather, it was more accurate to speak of being king or count in a place. Therefore, it was possible for multiple counts to exist in Castile at the same time. There were counts in Burgos, Lara, Lantarón, Cerezo, Amaya, Castrojeriz, Osma, San Esteban de Gormaz, and several other centers of power, without any single authority uniting them all beyond the King of León himself. What were Fernán González's family origins that allowed him to emerge as the sole count over these territories? The lineage of Fernán González's mother, Muniadona, played a dominant role in the district of Lara, and her family continued to exercise that leadership even after Fernán González became Count of all Castile. It is also relevant to note that the first historical mention of Fernán González appears in a diploma from 929, where he is described as Count in Lara. Even more important for the meteoric rise of Fernán González's lineage was the role of his father, Gonzalo Fernández, who led the political integration of Asa, San Esteban de Gormaz, and Clunia into the astur-leonese kingdom. The latter two strongholds were especially important for the defense of Castile, and their strategic position on the frontier gave great political power to whoever controlled them, as well as opportunities to build strong political and military client networks. In addition, two counts mentioned in Burgos and Castile in the 920s were possibly uncles of Fernán González. All this means that his relatives already played a dominant role in Castile, alongside the rival Ansúrez family. The union of the states of Gonzalo Fernández and Muñadona, together with their client networks, made Fernán González a man well-positioned to exercise hegemony in Castile. The period of multiple counts in Castile was a fluid phase of internal competition among regional aristocracies, since opportunities for social advancement and control over new territories were open. This stage ended in 931 or 932, when Fernán González managed to dominate Castilian politics. How and why did Fernán González become Count of all Castile and Álava? To understand this, we must go back to the civil war between Ramiro II of León and Alfonso IV of León, which I discussed in episode 42, The Making of the Caliphate of Córdoba. Several Castilian magnates, mainly the Ansúrez and the Banu Gómez of the neighboring county of Saldaña, supported the rebellion of the former king Alfonso IV, but Fernán González remained loyal to Ramiro II. In 932, Ramiro defeated his brother and needed an influential and trustworthy Castilian, and the only viable option was Fernán González. He obtained both the county of Álava and a reunified county of Castile. The county of Castile was the largest territorial division of the Kingdom of León, so granting this vast territory together with Álava to a single magnate was a risky move for Ramiro. But the political circumstances created by the civil war left him little choice. From a military standpoint too, in order to confront the growing threats posed by Abdelrahman III, who had just proclaimed himself caliph, it made sense to concentrate authority in one man to facilitate mobilization and strengthen defense along the frontier most vulnerable to Muslim attacks. Over time, Castile evolved from a highly local, relatively egalitarian society into a more centralized one. Aristocrats consolidated land, bishoprics and monasteries expanded control, and local elites were integrated into wider power networks. Fernán González played a key role in this shift, strengthening regional authority through power based on alliances and aristocratic cooperation. Fernán González at the head of Álava and Castile. The first indisputable mention of Fernán González as Count of a reunified Castile appears in a diploma dated May 1st, 932. Thanks to surviving legal documents, we can see that from 932 onward, most court cases in the Castilian counties were conducted in the presence of Fernán González or of lay or ecclesiastical delegates appointed by him. Trials were one of the clearest expressions of power in the early Middle Ages, and disputes were more often won by the powerful, who continued to accumulate more authority and property. On another note, the skilled matchmaker Quinto da Pamplona married one of her daughters to King Ramiro and another to Count Fernán González. Fernán's wife had previously been married for several months to King Ordoño II of León, and later for several years to the Count of Álava, with whom she had at least 2 children. She thus married for a third time, reflecting how high aristocratic women were used rather crudely as political currency. From this union were born 4 sons and 3 daughters. The 4th son, García Sánchez, lived long enough to succeed his father as Count of Castile and Álava in 970. These marriages, which reinforced cooperation among the northern Christian kingdoms, the unification of Castile under a single count, and the threat of expansion beyond the Douro River, provoked a reaction from the Caliphate of Córdoba. The Caliph confronted the forces of Ramiro II of León and Fernán González in the campaign of Osma in 934 and in the Battle of Simancas Aljándega in 939. I will not go into detail here since I already discussed these campaigns in episode 43. During the 940s, the Caliphate of Córdoba changed its military strategy, shifting from a few large campaigns to many smaller raids, mainly using cavalry to increase speed and reduce risk. This strategy proved highly effective. Because southern Castile, with strongholds such as Clunia, Osma, and San Esteban de Gormaz, was a military frontier, Castilian political control was vulnerable to Andalusi offensives. This sometimes caused territories to change hands during the reigns of Abdelrahman III and Al-Hakam II, and later under Almanzor. This frontier character deeply shaped Castilian society, making it highly militarized, to the benefit of the ruling class. Between February and May of 944, Count Fernán González of Castile and Álava and Count Diego Muñoz of Saldaña rebelled. However, King Ramiro II of León quickly arrested them and removed them from office. Unfortunately, we don't have any more details about the uprising. We should remember that between the territory of León, firmly controlled by the astur-leonese dynasty, and the county of Castile, there were two important counties. Monzón, ruled by the Ansúrez family, along the Pisuerga and Arlanzón rivers, and Saldaña, controlled by the Gómez family, along the Carrión river. After imprisoning Fernán González and Diego Muñoz, Ramiro II appointed his son Sancho, later King Sancho the Fat, as Count of Castile. Since Sancho was still a minor and the astur-leonese dynasty had weak ties in Castile, the king placed him under the guardianship of Count Fernández of Monzón, who effectively exercised comital power in the absence of the Lara lineage. Shortly after the rebellion, Ramiro donated an apple orchard that had belonged to Fernán González to the monastery of San Pedro de Cardeña, the most important monastery in Castile at the time, and the one most closely associated with the count. This donation of confiscated land before the people of Burgos symbolized Fernán González's fall from grace. However, Ramiro neither executed nor blinded Fernán González, nor did he confiscate most of his property. Instead, he ended both his captivity and that of the Patriarch of the Banu Gómez in late 944 or early 945, after agreeing to marry Fernán's daughter, Urraca, to one of his sons, the future King Ordoño III of León. We can only speculate about why the battle-hardened Leonese monarch restored such an important position to Fernán González. Did Fernán still wield so much power? Did Ramiro need him in order to govern Castile effectively because of the strong power networks the Count had built among local elites? The answer is probably yes. This is similar to how the emirs and caliphs of Córdoba were unable to replace the Banu Qasi and later the Banu Tuyib in the Upper March without risking more instability. If Ramiro had been able to do so, he would have preferred to keep his son ruling Castile. Did Fernán González make Castile independent from León? This is the central question. Did Fernán González achieve Castile's independence? The short answer is no. We cannot say the county of Castile was independent during Fernán González's rule or at his death. Nor can we speak of Castilian independence until the emergence of a separate kingdom of Castile in the second half of the 11th century. A good way to understand this is by comparing Castile with the Catalan counties of the 10th century. Despite difficulties, Ramiro was able to arrest and replace Fernán González for some time after his rebellion. Only after Fernán's death did the kings of León lose the ability to appoint and dismiss the Count of Castile, largely due to the weakening of royal authority. It is true that after Fernán González's death, the county became patrimonial and hereditary, forming a comital dynasty. This might suggest independence. However, a stronger counter-argument is that the Counts of Castile were deeply involved in all the dynastic struggles of León after Ramiro II's death in 951. This contrasts with Catalonia, where the counts south of the Pyrenees had not intervened in Frankish dynastic conflicts since the time of Wilfred the Hairy. So, was Castile independent in the 10th century? No. Did it enjoy broad political autonomy that increased under Fernán González after Ramiro's death? Yes, as it happened elsewhere in the Kingdom of León. Maps can be misleading. Like many medieval states, the astur-leonese kingdom never exercised uniform control over its territories, and this was especially true in Castile. The king only issued 4 documents in Castile. This lack of royal intervention is explained by the dynasty's weak land holdings in the region and by an implicit agreement with Castilian elites granting autonomy. The Count of Castile and Álava was essentially the sole intermediary between the king and the local aristocracy. This gave him enormous power. He made local appointments, mobilized troops, and received loyalty. Castilian documents were dated according to the Leonese king and usually mentioned both king and count together. After unification under Fernán González, this formula symbolized political unity after internal competition. This practice did not exist in Galicia or León, where dating by the Hispanic era was more common. It reflects recognition of royal authority while also showing that the king was distant. In Castile, the king could intervene militarily, suppress rebellions, establish ties of loyalty, summon assemblies, and appoint or dismiss counts, at least until Ramiro II. Beyond that, his authority was more symbolic than practical. Fernán González's shifting loyalties and political maneuvers must be understood in the context of dynastic instability after Ramiro's death, Córdoba's dominance, and the growing influence of Pamplona. Like any great magnate, his main goal was to accumulate power and property for his descendants. He was an opportunist who navigated the political tides of his time skillfully. He turned his prominent lineage into Castile's ruling dynasty, and when he died in 970, passed on his authority to his son García Fernández without Leonese interference. The verdict. Today, Fernán González is far less well known than figures like Pelagius of Asturias or Wilfred the Hairy. Until the mid-20th century, most Castilians knew of his deeds and supposed independence. Today, this is less certain. While historians have demythologized all three figures, Pelagius and Wilfred remain popular because nationalistic narratives have favored them. A count who supposedly divided Christian unity does not fit the Reconquista narrative of Spanish nationalism. And with that, the verdict ends. If you have made it this far, it's probably because you enjoyed this episode, so please give it a like and subscribe to the show for more content on Spanish history on YouTube or podcast directories. You can support me with a donation or on Patreon. In the next episode, I'm going to explain the late reign of Abderrahman III and his son Al-Hakam II, along with what was going on in the north, where Christian states were becoming satellites of Córdoba. Thank you for your attention, and see you next time!